"You'll never be my wife," said the millionaire. 2 years later, he saw her, with his daughters. Ricky Dooley stepped out of his town car beneath a chandelier of crystal lights hanging over the entrance of the Westbridge Charity Pavilion. The evening air brushed his tailored suit, and a line of guests parted instinctively as he passed. Executives leaned closer to whisper his name. Donors smiled too wide. Board members straightened their shoulders when they saw him coming. Tonight wasn't about generosity. It was about presence, about being seen as the man who could write a check so large it erased entire problems with a single stroke of ink. Ricky didn't look around for familiar faces. He never did. He walked with the calm certainty of someone who had learned that money could smooth any awkward silence and soften any memory he didn't wish to carry. Inside the glass-walled lobby, violins drifted over polished floors while servers offered champagne he didn't touch. He nodded to a few people who mattered, ignored the ones who didn't, and checked the time on a watch that cost more than some homes. For 2 years, every gala had been the same. Smile, donate, leave. Return to a place too quiet to call home. Tonight, he thought, would be no different. Ricky moved through the main hall with his usual practiced rhythm, already planning his exit before the first speech could begin. But just as he reached the edge of the courtyard doors, a sound broke through the polite noise of the event. Laughter, not the restrained kind meant for donors and cameras, real laughter. Free, unguarded. He turned without meaning to. Across the open courtyard, framed by strings of soft lights and climbing ivy, Vernice Beer stood near the stone fountain. Her head was tipped back slightly, her smile wide in a way that had nothing to do with impressing anyone. For a heartbeat, Ricky couldn't place the feeling that tightened his chest. Surprise came first, then disbelief. She looked different, not in her clothes or her posture, but in her ease, as if the weight he'd always carried around her had never existed. Ricky's steps slowed, then stopped. He hadn't seen her since the night she drove away, eyes steady even as her voice broke. 2 years of promotions, acquisitions, and headlines had buried the memory, or so he thought. Yet there she was, in the one place he never expected her to be, smiling like she belonged. His fingers tightened around the rim of his empty glass. The gala, the crowd, the music faded into a distant murmur. All he could see was Vernice, alive in a world he had closed the door on. Ricky was still standing there, caught between memory and disbelief, when he heard a voice he knew better than his own. "Daddy!" He turned, expecting the familiar rush of Cordia's arms or Allison's shy wave from behind their nanny. Instead, he saw both girls dart past him, dresses fluttering, shoes tapping against the stone tiles as they raced into the courtyard. They didn't stop for him. They didn't even slow down. Cordia reached Vernice first, wrapping her arms around her waist with the careless confidence children reserve for people who feel safe. Allison followed a step behind, pressing close, her small hand slipping naturally into Vernice's. Ricky stood rooted where he was, his name still hanging in the air unanswered. "Did you see the fountain light up?" Cordia said, breathless. "And the music is better out here," Allison added, smiling up at Vernice in a way Ricky hadn't seen directed at him in longer than he cared to admit. Vernice bent slightly to meet them at eye level, her hand brushing hair away from Cordia's face. The gesture was quiet, protective, unplanned. Ricky felt the distance between himself and the three of them stretch wider than the courtyard itself. He had always believed love waited for him when he was ready. Tonight, it had already arrived, and he hadn't been invited. Ricky's mouth opened, but no sound came out. From where he stood, he watched Vernice kneel slightly, so she could hear Allison over the music drifting from inside. Cordia tugged on Vernice's sleeve, pointing toward the dessert table as if this were their shared night, their shared place. Not once did either girl look back at him. The truth arrived without warning and without mercy. The woman I turned away is becoming the person my daughters run to. It wasn't jealousy that burned in his chest. It was recognition. Recognition that someone else had learned their rhythms, their moods, the small signals that meant a day had been hard or a question had gone unasked. Ricky saw it in the way Vernice listened with her whole body, in the slight tilt of her head, in the patience he had traded for board meetings and quarterly calls. He had spent years convincing himself that his girls were fine because they were provided for. Best schools, best care, best everything. But standing there, watching them lean into someone who wasn't him, he understood what he had really purchased. Distance. The gala continued behind him, applause rising for a speaker he couldn't hear. All Ricky could hear was a sentence he once flung out like a shield, now echoing back as a verdict. "You'll never be my wife." And somehow, without ever asking, she had become far more than that. This is the instant where Ricky's carefully built life finally confronts him. A man who owns more than most people ever will, standing in a courtyard, realizing that the one thing he thought he could always come back to has been quietly claimed by someone else. Maybe you know this feeling. Have you ever stayed so busy that you didn't notice when someone stopped waiting for you? Ever told yourself you were doing it all for your family, only to look up one day and feel like a guest in their lives? Ricky told himself that success would protect him from pain, that if he kept moving, kept building, kept winning, the ache he buried with his wife would eventually lose its voice. But grief doesn't leave when you ignore it. It just waits. So here he is, not because he failed in business, but because he succeeded too loudly. Every deal he closed made the silence at home easier to avoid. Every night he stayed late made it simpler to skip hard conversations with two girls who were growing up without him. And now the person who once tried to help him breathe again is standing a few steps away, holding the trust he never realized he was handing over. Ricky isn't angry at Vernice. He isn't angry at his daughters. He's angry at himself for believing love would stay exactly where he left it, for thinking people don't change when you're not paying attention, for assuming that absence never adds up to loss. This story isn't about a millionaire losing his place. It's about what happens when a person finally sees the cost of everything they've been calling survival. Ricky had no idea, standing in that courtyard, that this was the first honest moment he'd had in years. He didn't yet know how he would begin to earn his way back into his daughters' lives, or whether the woman he once shut out would ever look at him the same way again. All he knew was this: before the night was over, he would have to face the version of himself he had spent 2 years avoiding. And that's the journey you're about to take with him. How does a man who has everything lose the one thing that matters most? How does he go from a stranger in his own family to someone his children can finally trust again? And what does it take to admit that the sentence you spoke in fear doesn't have to be the ending of your life? If this is your first time here, welcome to Mr. Cooper Stories, a place for stories that don't just entertain, but remind us who we are when the noise fades. And to everyone who's been walking with us, thank you for coming back. Before we step into the beginning of Ricky's story, do me a favor. Tap the like button if you've ever had to choose between ambition and the people you love. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story that might speak directly to where you are right now. And in the comments, type home if you believe it's never too late to find your way back. Ricky Dooley didn't grow up dreaming of yachts or corner offices. He grew up counting what his family didn't have. His earliest memories were of his mother stretching dinners into 3 nights, of school shoes that stayed too tight for too long, of the quiet embarrassment that followed him through classrooms where other kids talked about vacations he'd never take. His father worked until his hands stayed cracked year-round, yet the bills still landed heavier than paydays. Ricky learned fast that hope didn't keep the lights on. What he did keep was a promise he never said out loud. Someday, he would live in a place where no one could take anything from him. No overdue notice would knock at his door. No teacher would pull him aside to ask why the lunch balance hadn't cleared. He would never stand in line pretending not to care. That promise followed him everywhere, into his scholarships, his late-night study sessions, the businesses he built while other kids slept. While his friends chased weekends, Ricky chased certainty. And it worked. Money became his shield. Achievement became his language. The more he collected, the safer he felt. He didn't know then that the same hunger that pulled him out of scarcity would one day pull him away from the people he loved most. Ricky met Lorna before he had anything to offer except ambition and a nervous habit of over-planning his future. She was the first person who looked past the grind and asked who he was when he stopped chasing the next goal. She didn't care that his apartment still echoed when he walked across it. She brought houseplants he forgot to water and laughter that filled the rooms anyway. Where Ricky measured life in milestones, Lorna measured it in moments, Sunday mornings that began with burnt pancakes, evenings where no one checked the clock. With her, success stopped feeling like escape and started feeling like shared direction. He learned to loosen his grip on work long enough to listen to her stories about teaching music to children who didn't believe they were talented yet. When Cordia was born, he held something fragile for the first time without fear. Allison followed 2 years later, small and bright-eyed, already reaching for sounds before words. Ricky didn't realize it then, but those years were the only stretch of his life where money wasn't the point. He still chased growth, still stayed busy, but it was different. It had a center. For the first time since childhood, Ricky felt anchored, not to wealth, but to people who knew the difference between the man he was becoming and the boy he had been. Lorna's absence didn't arrive all at once. It settled in the house the way cold does when no one notices the windows are open. Ricky went back to work 3 days after the funeral, not because he was strong, but because meetings asked less of him than his daughter's eyes did. He learned which questions to answer and which ones to avoid. He mastered the art of standing beside grief without ever stepping inside it. People praised him for holding it together, for staying productive, for not falling apart. What they couldn't see was how he folded his life smaller. Photos came down. Her favorite mug went to the back of the cabinet. He started keeping the lights low at night so the rooms wouldn't remind him of the way she used to move through them. Cordia cried until her throat went hoarse. Allison stopped asking where Mommy was and started asking when Daddy was coming home. Ricky told himself he would deal with the pain later, after the next project, after the next quarter, after the next win. But later never came, and little by little the man who once laughed too loudly at breakfast became someone who learned how to disappear while standing in the middle of his own life. The move to the penthouse was supposed to be a fresh start. Ricky chose it for the view, floor-to-ceiling windows, ceilings high enough to swallow sound, a skyline that looked like possibility. What he didn't expect was how quiet it would feel once the doors closed. Every room carried too much space, too much echo. The furniture was modern and expensive, selected by people who had never met his family. No one argued about colors. No one fought over where to hang drawings from school. The walls stayed clean because there was nothing personal enough to mark them. At night, Ricky often stood in the living room staring out at the city, phone in hand, scrolling through numbers that refused to comfort him. The higher he climbed, the farther away the ground felt. Sometimes he turned on the television just to hear another voice in the apartment. Other nights he sat in the dark because it felt closer to how he moved through his days. The penthouse didn't feel like a home. It felt like a place built for a man who was trying not to remember what it was like to be held together by anything other than silence. Ricky started small. First, it was hiring a driver so he could take calls during the commute. Then a personal assistant to manage schedules he no longer trusted himself to remember. After that came the tutors, the nannies, the coordinators who handled every detail that once belonged to him. Cordia learned to buckle her seatbelt in the back of a town car. Allison learned which adults to ask for snacks and which ones to ask for homework help. Ricky told himself this was efficiency, that delegating the small things made room for the big responsibilities that paid for their lives. But the trade was uneven. He missed the mornings when Cordia asked him to check her backpack. He missed the way Allison used to wait by the door at night, pretending she was just stretching when she was really listening for his key in the lock. By the time he noticed the gaps, his absence had already become routine. His daughters stopped asking when he'd be home. They asked who would be home. Ricky kept a calendar that never forgot anything. Board votes, investor calls, flights scheduled to the minute. He prided himself on never missing a deadline that affected revenue. But the dates that didn't show up in bold print were the ones that mattered most. Cordia stood on a small auditorium stage one spring afternoon, scanning the crowd for a face that wasn't there. Allison waited after school with a handmade card she had hidden in her backpack for weeks, telling her teacher her father was just stuck in traffic again. Ricky found the card 3 days later under a stack of documents his assistant had placed on his desk. He read it quickly, folded it neatly, and slid it into a drawer he never opened. There were texts he meant to answer after the next meeting, calls he planned to return once things settled down. They never did. What he didn't realize was that every unanswered message trained his daughters to expect less of him, quietly, without anger, until disappointment felt normal. One Friday evening, Ricky's phone vibrated during a negotiation he couldn't afford to step away from. He glanced down long enough to see Cordia's name light up the screen, then placed the phone face down and kept talking. By the time he remembered the call, the office was dark and the deal was done. There was a voicemail waiting. He told himself he'd listen in the morning. Another message arrived 2 days later, then another the week after that. His phone stored them in a small digital corner he never opened because it felt easier to pretend nothing was waiting there. What Ricky didn't know was that his daughters had started treating those messages like bottles dropped into the ocean. Cordia recorded stories about her day as if he were sitting beside her. Allison sang the first verse of a song she was learning, stopping halfway to whisper that she hoped he was proud. The messages stayed unheard. Eventually, the calls slowed. Then they stopped. Ricky didn't notice right away. He was too busy winning everything that didn't know his name. Bernice Beer didn't arrive at Dooley Global the way most consultants did. No tailored suit, no entourage, no tablet already open to a slide deck full of buzzwords. She stepped through the glass doors with a worn canvas bag slung over her shoulder and a pause in her stride, as if she were listening to the building before deciding where to go. The lobby gleamed with polished stone and reflective steel, but she didn't seem impressed. She glanced at the high ceilings, the empty seating areas, the art that looked expensive without feeling personal. Employees glanced up from their desks, confused by how little she fit the usual pattern. At the reception counter, Bernice smiled gently and gave her name. No rush in her voice, no pressure, just presence. When the elevator doors closed behind her a moment later, she leaned against the mirrored wall and closed her eyes briefly, breathing in as though she were about to enter someone else's home instead of a corporate headquarters. Ricky would later remember none of that. But in that first quiet minute, before titles and contracts and expectations collided, Bernice had already seen what the rest of them missed. This building didn't feel like a workplace. It felt like a place people passed through without ever staying. Bernice didn't begin her work by sketching furniture or choosing colors. She walked. From floor to floor, she traced the rhythm of the building the way someone might learn the layout of a new town. She paused near break rooms that went unused, meeting areas that felt more like waiting zones than gathering places. To her, walls weren't just barriers. They were boundaries that told people whether they were welcome to linger. She carried a small notebook in her canvas bag, but she rarely wrote in it. Instead, she listened, to footsteps echoing too long in empty halls, to conversations cut short by sterile spaces that didn't invite them to continue. When a junior analyst asked what exactly she was looking for, Bernice answered without slowing her pace. People leave pieces of themselves everywhere they spend time, she said. If a room doesn't give anything back, they stop showing up fully. Her work wasn't about making things fashionable. It was about giving people permission to feel less alone inside places built only for output. She believed buildings could either drain the life out of those who walked through them or quietly remind them that they were more than the jobs they held. Dooley Global had been built for results. Bernice intended to build something that could hold people. Ricky met Bernice between meetings, his phone still warm from a call he hadn't wanted to end. He scanned her quickly, the canvas bag, the lack of branding, the way she stood without trying to take up more space than necessary, and already decided she wasn't going to slow anything down. Just make the place look less empty, he said, eyes drifting back to his screen. We've got a board tour in 6 weeks. Bernice didn't respond right away. She glanced down the corridor behind him, then back to his face, studying him with the same attention she gave the walls. Less empty isn't the same as more alive, she said. Ricky felt a brief pinch of irritation. Consultants were supposed to nod, not correct him. I'm not interested in philosophy, he replied, tapping his phone to signal the end of the exchange. We just need results. She smiled politely, but her eyes didn't move away from his. Results depend on how people feel when they're here. The elevator arrived. Ricky stepped inside without another word, already halfway into the next problem on his list. He told himself the conversation was over, but as the doors closed, he caught his reflection in the mirrored panel, and for a reason he couldn't place, the image unsettled him. 2 days later, Ricky found Bernice standing alone at the far end of the executive floor, studying a stretch of hallway no one ever used. You're redesigning offices, not solving people, he said, stopping beside her. She didn't turn right away. That hallway looks impressive, she said. but nobody lingers here. It's too clean, too quiet." Ricky crossed his arms. Empty rooms don't scare anyone. That's when she faced him. "Empty lives do." The words weren't sharp, yet they landed with weight. She didn't accuse him. She didn't explain. She simply offered the thought and let it rest between them. Ricky opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing in his rehearsed responses that applied. "I don't have time for this," he said finally. Vernice nodded once, accepting the boundary without retreating from the truth she had named. "People make time for what keeps them awake at night," she replied quietly, then returned to studying the hallway. Ricky walked away with the strange feeling that he had just been spoken to in a language he didn't want to understand, one that had nothing to do with contracts or timelines, and everything to do with the spaces he had been leaving untouched inside himself. Ricky carried Vernice's words into his next meeting like a loose object in his pocket, something he couldn't quite get rid of no matter how many times he shifted position. He stared through a presentation about quarterly projections, nodding at the right places while his attention slipped back to that unused hallway and the calm certainty in her voice. Empty lives do. He didn't believe in statements that couldn't be measured. Still, he found himself glancing at the clock, feeling an impatience that had nothing to do with schedules. That evening, instead of heading straight for the elevator, he walked the executive floor alone. He stood where Vernice had stood, looking down the corridor that led nowhere important. It felt strange to be aware of a place he'd passed every day without seeing. Nothing had changed about the building, yet something had shifted in him. For the first time in years, Ricky noticed how his own footsteps echoed longer than they should, how the silence between walls mirrored the one he carried home each night. He told himself it was just fatigue, too many hours, too many responsibilities. But as he turned toward the elevators, he caught himself wondering when he had started living in rooms that didn't know his name. The changes began quietly. Ricky noticed them first in the lobby, where a stretch of gray stone had been replaced with panels of soft wood grain that held the light instead of throwing it back. New seating appeared, not the stiff, upright kind meant to hurry people along, but curved benches that suggested it was acceptable to pause. Then came the artwork. Not abstract splashes that belonged to no one, but images of ordinary moments, people talking across small tables, children leaning into parents on park benches, hands passing cups of coffee. Employees slowed when they walked past. Conversations lasted a little longer. Laughter traveled farther than it used to. Ricky pretended he didn't care, yet he found himself taking different routes through the building just to pass through the areas she had touched. The place didn't feel softer, exactly. It felt awake. He told himself this was good for morale, for productivity. But there was another reason he didn't name. Those spaces were starting to feel less like a corporate fortress and more like something he remembered from long ago, before silence became his default language. At first, Ricky told himself he was just being thorough. He finished meetings and didn't immediately leave. He lingered near the mezzanine after most of the staff had gone home, pretending to answer emails while Vernice and her small team adjusted lighting or moved furniture a few inches at a time. She worked without ceremony, no grand announcements, just quiet focus, as though each room were a person that needed listening more than instruction. One night, Ricky realized he had stayed so late the cleaning crew had already come and gone. The building was reduced to the low hum of climate systems and the soft sounds of Vernice's footsteps. She caught him watching and smiled without surprise. "Most people don't stick around once the workday ends," she said. "I'm just—" "Reviewing progress," he replied too quickly. She nodded, accepting the excuse he didn't need to offer. Ricky returned to his phone, but he wasn't reading anything. He was paying attention to the way the light changed when she moved a lamp, to how the room felt fuller without adding anything expensive. For reasons he didn't yet understand, he didn't want to leave. The photograph had lived inside Ricky's desk drawer for so long he'd almost forgotten it was there. One evening, as Vernice asked him to approve a small change in the executive lounge, he opened the drawer without thinking, searching for a pen that wasn't where it should have been. The picture slid forward just enough for the edge to show. Vernice didn't comment right away. She waited until he finished signing the form, then nodded toward the open drawer. "Is that your family?" Ricky hesitated before answering. She didn't correct him. She didn't press. She simply leaned closer, careful not to intrude. The photo showed Lorna between two younger versions of Cordia and Allison, all three laughing at something Ricky had cut out of the frame. "You keep them hidden," Vernice said gently. "They don't belong in this world," he replied, closing the drawer. She looked around the room, the clean lines, the view that didn't invite anyone to stay, then back at him. "Maybe this world is what doesn't belong to them." The words settled into the space between them, heavier than anything she had moved that day. Ricky expected the moment to pass. He expected Vernice to return to her work in the building to swallow the conversation the way it always did. But later that evening, as they walked the executive floor together, she spoke again. "You talk about your daughters as if they're visitors in your life," she said. "They have everything they need," Ricky answered, though the words felt practiced. She stopped near a window that overlooked the city and faced him. "Children don't measure care in resources. They measure it in who shows up." Ricky glanced at the skyline, searching for something solid to hold on to. "This world is demanding," he said. "It's not built for kids." Vernice's voice softened. "Then build another one for them." He didn't reply. But that night, when he returned to his apartment, he noticed how little of his daughter's laughter lived there, and for the first time he wondered whether the world he had created was truly for anyone at all. Ricky didn't sleep that night. He lay on top of the covers, phone resting on his chest, staring at the ceiling he had once admired for its height. The city beyond the windows glowed as it always did, unaware that something inside him had shifted. Children don't measure care and resources. They measure it in who shows up. He scrolled through his contacts until he found Cordia's name, then stopped. He hadn't called her directly in weeks. He told himself it was because she was busy, because the girls had routines now that didn't include him. That excuse felt thinner than it ever had. Ricky sat up and walked into the living room, the same place he'd stood 1,000 times thinking about nothing at all. This time, he noticed the silence as if it were speaking. He wasn't ready to change. He didn't know how, but a crack had opened, small, invisible to anyone else, yet wide enough for doubt to pass through. And doubt, once it finds a place to rest, doesn't leave easily. The storm arrived without warning, the way most turning points do. One moment the building hummed with its usual late-evening rhythm, a few lingering analysts, the soft roll of cleaning carts, and the next, thunder pressed against the glass, as if the night had decided it was done being ignored. Ricky was halfway through reviewing a proposal when the power dipped, screens flickering before settling into emergency lighting. An announcement came over the system advising everyone to remain where they were until the weather passed. By the time he stepped into the hallway, most of the staff had already left. Only a handful of offices glowed faintly, and somewhere down the corridor, he heard the quiet scrape of a chair. Vernice stood near the central atrium, watching rain streak down the tall windows. "Looks like we're here for a while," she said. Ricky checked his phone. No signal. The building that usually emptied on command now held them in place. Two people who had spent weeks circling one another without ever standing still long enough to speak. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, something waited. They found the break room by following the scent of burnt grounds. The machine whirred in short, tired bursts as Vernice coaxed it back to life, laughing softly when it refused to cooperate. Ricky watched her work without instruction manuals or irritation, as if this were another room that needed patience more than force. The lights blinked overhead, steady but dim, leaving the edges of the room softened. They sat across from each other at a small table that had probably gone unused for years, steam rising between them. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. Ricky realized how rarely he allowed himself to sit without checking the time. The quiet felt unfamiliar, like a language he had once known and forgotten. Outside the windows, rain pressed against the building, but inside, the world narrowed to 2 cups of coffee and the faint buzz of backup generators. "Strange," Vernice said at last, "how loud silence can be." Ricky didn't answer right away, but he didn't get up either. Ricky broke the silence first. "Do you ever feel like you're always surrounded by people and still alone?" He hadn't planned the question. It surprised him as much as it did her. Vernice studied the surface of her coffee, then nodded. "All the time." He leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting toward the ceiling. I used to think loneliness came from having nothing, he said. Now I think it comes from having too much of the wrong things. Bernice smiled faintly, and not enough of the ones that can't be scheduled. Ricky let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. I don't even know when it started. Most people don't, she replied. It happens slowly, like a room filling with things you don't need until there's nowhere left to sit. He absorbed that in silence. The rain continued its steady rhythm, as if marking time they'd forgotten to keep. Ricky hadn't talked about how he felt in years, not in words that didn't need a report attached. Tonight, he didn't feel like the man in charge of everything. He felt like someone who had misplaced a part of himself and only just noticed it was gone. Bernice didn't answer him right away. She stared into her cup, as if measuring how much of herself she was willing to set down in that quiet room. My sister used to call me whenever she felt overwhelmed, she said at last. Didn't matter what time it was, she just needed to hear someone breathing on the other end. Ricky waited. She moved across the country a few years ago. New job, new life. We kept saying we'd make time to visit each other. Vernice's smile flickered. One day the calls stopped, not because we were upset, because we were busy. She looked up then, meeting his eyes. It took me too long to realize that closeness doesn't fade from anger, it fades from neglect. Ricky felt the word settle somewhere he hadn't been willing to explore. Do you ever wish you could rewind? He asked quietly. All the time, she said. But wishing isn't the same as choosing differently when you still can. The room seemed to grow smaller, as if the walls had leaned in to listen. They didn't reach across the table. They didn't say anything that would need to be explained later. But something eased between them, something that hadn't existed before the storm. Ricky noticed the way Vernice tilted her head when she listened, how she let silence finish the sentences he couldn't. She noticed the way his shoulders lowered, just a fraction, when he wasn't performing for anyone. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was being evaluated. He felt understood. The rain softened, thunder retreating to distant rumbles, but neither of them moved to leave. The emergency lights hummed, steady and low, as though holding the moment in place. Ricky glanced at his phone. Still no signal. Strangely, he didn't mind. They finished their coffee in companionable quiet, the kind that didn't demand filling. When they finally stood, it was with the unspoken awareness that something had changed, not dramatically, not in ways either of them could label, but enough to make the building feel different. As they walked back into the hallway, Ricky realized he was no longer walking through rooms, he was walking beside someone. Before we go any further, pause with me for a second. If you've ever sat in a room full of people and still felt like no one truly saw you, if you've ever lost touch with someone you loved, not through anger but through simple distance, then this story is already speaking to something inside you. Ricky didn't change in that break room. Vernice didn't fix him. What happened was quieter. He allowed himself to be present, and sometimes that's the hardest step of all. So if this moment has touched you in any way, tap the like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this story with someone else who might need it just as much. And if you're new here, consider subscribing to Mr. Cooper Stories, where every week we explore lives that look complete on the outside and complicated on the inside. Now let's continue, because that quiet bond formed in a storm is about to be tested in ways neither of them can imagine yet. The night Vernice finally spoke didn't come with a storm. It came after a long day that felt ordinary enough to ignore. Meetings, design approvals, the quiet acknowledgement that the building no longer felt the same. They walked out together into the parking structure, their footsteps echoing through the concrete levels. Ricky reached for his phone out of habit, then stopped, slipping it back into his pocket as if he'd forgotten why he had picked it up in the first place. Vernice slowed near her car. "Ricky," she said. He turned, already bracing for another work-related question. The overhead lights cast a soft glow over the row of vehicles, leaving the far corners in shadow. The space felt too open for something private, yet too enclosed for escape. "I don't think we're just talking about floor plans anymore," she said carefully. Ricky's throat tightened. He told himself it was exhaustion, that everything felt heavier at the end of a long day. But he didn't leave. He stood there, waiting, unaware that the sentence he was about to hear would change the shape of his life. Vernice rested one hand on the roof of her car, grounding herself before speaking. "I didn't expect this," she said. When I took the contract, I thought I'd be here a few months, fix a few rooms, and leave." Ricky stayed quiet. "But somewhere between the paint samples and the late nights, I stopped seeing you as my client," she continued. "I started seeing the man who stays after everyone's gone, who pretends he's just checking emails when he's really listening to the building breathe." Her smile was tentative, as if she were testing whether honesty was welcome here. "I care about you," Vernice said, "not because of what you own, but because of who you are when you're not hiding." Ricky felt heat rise to his face. He wanted to respond with something measured, something safe. Nothing came. She wasn't asking for promises. She wasn't making demands. She was simply placing the truth between them and trusting him not to drop it. Ricky's first instinct wasn't joy. It was retreat. His mind rushed ahead of his heart, lining up everything that could go wrong. The girls, the press, the way people would look at her once they knew who he was to her, the way he would have to explain himself to people he didn't know anything to. More than that, he felt the familiar weight of loss pressing forward, reminding him of everything he hadn't survived as cleanly as his public image suggested. He crossed his arms, creating space where closeness had just tried to settle. "This is complicated," he said. Vernice nodded, but she didn't step back. "Most things worth caring about are—" Ricky looked past her, toward the ramp that led out of the garage. He imagined himself driving away, returning to a place where no one asked anything personal of him. He had rebuilt his life around certainty, around systems he could manage. This, whatever it was, didn't come with instructions. Fear answered before he could stop it. "I don't see this going anywhere," Ricky said, the words leaving him faster than thought. "You should know that." Vernice's brows drew together slightly. "That's not what I asked." He shook his head, forcing a calm he didn't feel. "I'm not built for this, for starting over, for pretending I can be someone else." She waited, giving him space to find something gentler to say. He didn't. "You'll never be my wife." Ricky realized too late that he'd chosen finality, when uncertainty would have been kinder. He had turned a moment of truth into a closed door. Vernice inhaled slowly, as if steadying herself against something invisible. "I never asked to be," she said. "But I deserved kindness." There was no anger in her voice, no attempt to wound him back. She reached for a door handle, and Ricky understood with a sharp, useless ache that he had just spoken, the one thing he would never be able to soften. Vernice didn't argue. She didn't demand an explanation or list all the ways he was wrong. She simply nodded once, as though acknowledging a truth she had suspected, but hoped not to meet so plainly. "I should have been clearer, with myself," she said. "Thank you for being clear with me." Ricky watched her open the car door, his chest tightening as the interior light flicked on and then faded. She didn't slam it. She didn't rush. Before she slid into the driver's seat, she looked back at him one last time. "I hope you find what you're looking for," Vernice said quietly. Then she closed the door and drove away, her car lights dissolving into the curves of the ramp. Ricky remained where he was, the empty space beside him suddenly larger than the parking structure itself. He had spent years perfecting exits. Ricky returned to the penthouse long after midnight, moving through the rooms without turning on many lights. The place greeted him with the same quiet it always had, only now it felt louder than the garage ever had. He set his keys on the counter and stood there, unsure what to do next. There was no one to report to, no task urgent enough to bury the echo of what he had just said. "You'll never be my wife." The words followed him from room to room like something unfinished. He poured a drink he didn't want and left it untouched on the table. He stared at the city through glass that no longer impressed him, watching the lights blink without meaning. In the bedroom, he opened the drawer he hadn't meant to open and saw the edge of the photograph again. Lorna between the girls, smiles he had once thought he could live without. Ricky slid down onto the edge of the bed, head in his hands. For the first time since his wife's passing, the success he had built felt less like safety and more like a place with too many doors closed and nowhere left to go. The months after Vernice left were the most profitable of Ricky's career. Dooley Global acquired smaller firms with surgical precision, absorbing competitors before they even realized they were vulnerable. His name appeared in business journals more frequently than ever, always paired with phrases like visionary leadership and relentless growth. Ricky accepted awards he barely remembered earning. He stood on stages beneath bright lights, thanking teams he no longer recognized, his voice steady while his thoughts wandered elsewhere. At night, he returned to the penthouse with the same sense of forward motion that followed him through every deal. The company had never been stronger, yet each milestone felt strangely weightless, like stepping on stairs that didn't quite meet his feet. Success had once promised relief. Now it felt like proof that moving ahead didn't guarantee moving closer to anything that mattered. Home became a place Ricky passed through rather than entered. He slept with his phone on the nightstand, but not for calls from his daughters. He waited for emails that justified staying awake, for alerts that reminded him he was needed somewhere beyond those walls. The penthouse stayed immaculate. Cleaning crews arrived twice a week, erasing any sign that a family ever belonged there. Even the refrigerator seemed curated for appearances rather than use. Ricky told himself he preferred it this way. Quiet was efficient, order meant control. Still, there were moments when he stood in the doorway of Cordia's room, untouched since her last overnight visit, and felt as though he were trespassing in a life he no longer knew how to enter. He didn't cry. He simply stopped expecting anything from the place that once held his evenings together. Ricky began to notice the change in the smallest ways. Cordia no longer filled the silences on their rare calls, where she once talked over herself, eager to share every detail of her day. She now waited for him to ask questions he didn't always think to pose. Allison's voice sounded older, steadier, as if she were practicing how to speak without expecting interruption. They told him about school, projects only after they were finished. They mentioned friends he had never heard of. Their lives had continued, complete and unfolding, while his stayed paused on the last moment he could remember being present. Ricky blamed distance, travel schedules, the demands of a growing company. But the truth rested closer than he wanted to admit. They were learning how to live without him, and he had taught them how. Ricky sent gifts, large ones, thoughtful ones, according to assistants who tracked what children were supposed to like at certain ages. He arranged deliveries timed to arrive during school hours so teachers could display them and classmates could admire the ribbons. But he didn't show up. Cordia turned 10 with a party held in a neighbor's backyard, while Ricky sat in a conference room 3 states away, glancing at his phone only when the meeting ended. Allison's birthday followed the same pattern: balloons in the morning, voicemail in the afternoon, silence by nightfall. Ricky convinced himself that the girls understood, that someday they would look back and appreciate the sacrifices he had made for them. What he didn't consider was how memories work. They don't preserve intentions, they preserve moments. Ricky learned about it by accident. He was scrolling through social media late one night, pausing longer than he should have on a photo Cordia's school had posted from a field trip. Her smile looked genuine, but he noticed she wasn't looking at the camera. She was leaning toward a friend, mid-laugh, fully inside a world he barely touched. On impulse, he tapped her contact. The call rang until it cut to silence. No greeting, no recorded message in her voice. Later, he texted instead. The message didn't go through. Ricky stared at the screen, then tried again. Still nothing. It took a long moment for him to accept what that small technical failure actually meant. Cordia had removed his number. There was no announcement, no argument, no slammed door, just absence. Ricky set the phone down slowly, as if it might break under the weight of what he had just learned. For the first time, he wondered if the space between him and his daughters had already grown too wide for him to cross 2 years after the night Vernice drove away. Ricky returned to the same charity gala, with a different posture but the same armor. The venue was larger this time, an open-air courtyard surrounded by tall columns and hanging lights that made the crowd shimmer like a living constellation. Ricky arrived to the familiar ritual. Greetings from board members, handshakes from donors, polite jokes from people who spoke to him only when they needed something. He signed checks, posed for photos, spoke into microphones with a voice that hadn't changed even if the man behind it had. The gala still revolved around him. Yet something about the evening felt off, as if he were repeating a role he no longer recognized as his own. He found himself scanning faces he didn't expect to see, unsure what he was looking for. That uncertainty followed him past the cocktail tables and into the courtyard, where the courtyard opened wide, laughter lifting above the gentle music playing from hidden speakers. Ricky was halfway through another donor conversation when movement caught his attention. Near the center fountain, framed by warm lights and low greenery, Vernice stood with two girls he recognized before his mind was ready to admit it. Cordia's hair was pulled back in the same uneven way it had always been when she dressed herself. Allison held a paper cup with both hands, her shoulders tucked inward in that familiar way she used when she felt shy. They weren't with a nanny. They weren't scanning the crowd for him. They were with Vernice. Ricky excused himself without explanation, his heart beginning to pound in a way no negotiation ever produced. He took one step toward them, then stopped. The three of them were laughing. Not the polite kind, not the kind reserved for donors or cameras, but the kind that rose without checking who was watching. For a moment, Ricky felt as if he were standing outside a room that used to belong to him, looking in through glass that didn't recognize his reflection. Ricky didn't realize he had said their names out loud until Cordia turned. "Daddy," she said, surprise flickering across her face. He took a step closer, careful not to startle her, his eyes shifting briefly to Vernice before settling back on his daughter. "What are you doing here?" he asked, already knowing the question wasn't really what he meant. Cordia shrugged, the way children do when the answer seems obvious. "Miss Vernice invited us." Ricky glanced at Vernice again, unable to hide his confusion. "She listens to us," Cordia added, as if offering clarification for something much larger than a simple invitation. "Listens." The word struck harder than any accusation could have. Ricky nodded slowly, his mouth dry. "That's good." Cordia smiled, a small, careful smile that stayed close to her face instead of reaching for him the way it once had. Ricky felt the distance in that space, not measured in feet but in the years he had chosen work over wonder, urgency over attention. Allison shifted closer to Vernice, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her sleeve as if to make sure she wouldn't drift away. "She makes us feel safe," Allison said quietly, almost as an afterthought. Ricky lowered himself slightly so he could meet her at eye level. "I've always tried to keep you safe," he said. Allison didn't disagree. She simply looked at him with the careful honesty only children possess. "You're always busy," she replied. There was no blame in her voice, just fact. Ricky straightened slowly, feeling as though the ground beneath the courtyard had tilted. Safe wasn't about locked doors or paid security. It was about who stayed when the noise faded. Vernice met his eyes for the first time since he had approached them. There was no triumph there, no judgment, only the quiet steadiness he remembered from the hallway outside his office. Ricky had built a life where everyone depended on him, yet here, in the middle of his own event, he stood as the least necessary person in the conversation. And he finally understood that being needed wasn't the same as being trusted. Ricky had always believed his absence was temporary, that no matter how far he drifted, his place would remain open, like a chair that never gets taken because everyone knows who it belongs to. But as he watched Cordia point excitedly toward the dessert table while Allison tugged Vernice closer to hear a story, he saw how easily that chair could be filled. The girls weren't betraying him. They were surviving him. They had found a way to feel seen in a life that had grown too wide for him to cover alone. Ricky felt something in his chest loosen, not with relief, but with truth. The truth that love doesn't wait out of loyalty. It grows where it's watered. For the first time, he didn't blame anyone else for the space he was losing. He blamed the years he had mistaken success for presence. Pause with me for a moment. Ricky is standing in the middle of everything he once believed would make him whole, yet realizing he might be the easiest part of his daughter's lives to live without. If you've ever looked at someone you love and felt the weight of all the moments you didn't show up for, this part of the story probably feels close to home. If you believe people deserve another opportunity to grow, to show up, to choose differently, go to the comments right now and type second chances. It helps this story reach someone who might still be standing in their own courtyard moment, wondering if the door is already closed. Now let's see what Ricky does with the truth he can no longer avoid. Ricky didn't make an announcement about the change. The next morning he simply told his assistant to cancel the standing contract with the car service. No town car, no chauffeur, no explanations. When the driver showed up out of habit that afternoon, Ricky met him at the curb himself. "You've been great," Ricky said, handing over a final check. "But I won't be needing your services anymore." The man looked confused. "Everything okay, sir?" Ricky nodded. "Better than it's been in a while." It wasn't a dramatic gesture. No one clapped. No article would ever mention it. But as Ricky walked back inside, keys in his own hand for the first time in years, he felt a strange mix of nerves and relief. The wheel felt heavier than he remembered. For the first time, he wouldn't be traveling while working. He would be present while moving. Ricky arrived at the girls' school 15 minutes early and parked crookedly between two minivans that made his sleek car feel out of place. When Cordia and Allison stepped outside, backpacks slung over their shoulders, they stopped short. "Where's the driver?" Cordia asked. Ricky lifted his keys. "Right here." They didn't rush him this time. They approached slowly as if testing whether this version of him would hold. On the drive home, Ricky asked about their day and waited, really waited, for the answers. Cordia talked about a science project. Allison described a game she had learned in music class. He missed the first turn out of the parking lot, then laughed at himself when the navigation rerouted. The girls exchanged glances in the back seat, uncertain at first, then smiling. For the first time in longer than Ricky could remember, the ride didn't feel like dead space between destinations. It felt like part of their day. Ricky began to memorize the small things, what days Cordia needed her gym shoes, which mornings Allison refused to eat unless her cereal had just the right amount of milk, the songs they played in the car, ones he pretended not to recognize but caught himself humming later. He learned that Cordia liked quiet after school, a few minutes to decompress before talking. Allison, on the other hand, filled silence with stories the moment her seatbelt clicked. These details didn't appear on calendars. They arrived in pieces, in ordinary moments he had once outsourced. Ricky wrote reminders in the notes section of his phone, not for meetings but for people. He began to anticipate instead of react, and when he got it right, when he showed up with the correct shoes or played the right song, the girls noticed. They didn't celebrate it. They trusted it. Ricky ruined more meals than he saved. Pasta stuck to the pot. Smoke alarms startled the neighbors. One night he served something that Cordia politely called interesting while Allison drowned it in ketchup. They took the long way home more often than the short one. Ricky missed exits, misread directions, laughed when the map insisted he turn around. Nothing about it was efficient. Yet the girls started waiting by the door again, not because he was perfect, but because he was there. Every mistake came with a story. Every delay came with a conversation. The hours he used to measure and profit margins were now spent deciding between tacos and leftovers. And for the first time, Ricky didn't feel behind. He felt involved. Vernice didn't re-enter their lives loudly. She didn't insert herself into school pickups or family dinners. She stayed where the girls already felt safe, in small check-ins, quiet texts, gentle reminders that change doesn't always arrive in a single moment. When Cordia hesitated before asking Ricky to attend a school event, Vernice was the one who encouraged her to try. "He's learning," she said. "Give him room to keep doing that." Allison confided in her after a missed call that reopened old doubts. Vernice listened, then suggested patience without promising perfection. Ricky never asked Vernice to do any of this, but slowly he noticed the difference. The girls leaned toward him more easily. Their questions came without rehearsal. Their laughter returned to the spaces where it had once gone quiet. Vernice never took credit. She simply believed that people don't become present because they're scolded into it. They do it because someone trusts them enough to try. Ricky chose the lake on impulse. He hadn't returned there since the summer Lorna taught the girls how to skip stones across the water, laughing when they missed more than they landed. The memory had lived in a place he avoided, sealed behind too many busy seasons. This year, he didn't let the date pass unnoticed. The drive took longer than expected. Cordia asked twice if they were lost. Allison hummed softly in the back seat, tracing the window with her finger. When the trees finally opened the shoreline, Ricky pulled into the same small gravel lot where they used to park, heart tightening as the familiar smell of water and pine drifted in. Nothing about the lake had changed. It still carried the calm that had once made Lorna linger on the dock long after the girls were tired. Ricky stepped out first, unsure how to lead a moment he had spent years postponing. "Why are we here?" Cordia asked gently. Ricky swallowed. "Because I should have come back sooner. They sat on the worn wooden bench near the shore, shoes abandoned in the grass. For a while, no one spoke. Then Cordia broke the silence. "She used to braid my hair when it got windy," she said, twisting a strand around her finger. "I didn't like it then. I miss it now." Allison nodded. She sang when she made breakfast, even when it was early. Ricky listened, hands clasped tightly in his lap. He had always believed he was protecting the girls by not mentioning Lorna, by keeping her name from reopening wounds. But the wounds had never closed. They had simply learned how to live around them. "Sometimes I forget what her voice sounded like," Cordia admitted, eyes fixed on the water. Ricky felt his chest tighten. "I have recordings," he said. "At home." The girls turned toward him in surprise. "You do?" Allison asked. He nodded. "I just didn't think you'd want to hear them." Cordia's voice was steady. "We do." The breeze lifted small ripples across the lake, carrying with it the faint smell of damp leaves and sun-warmed wood. Allison leaned her head against Ricky's arm, a rare gesture that made him hold his breath so he wouldn't disturb it. "She would like how you are now," Allison said softly. Ricky glanced down at her. "You think so?" Allison nodded. "You listen more, and you laugh different." He searched her face, looking for signs that she was trying to make him feel better. There were none. "She didn't want you to be sad forever," Allison added. Ricky closed his eyes, letting the words pass through him, instead of bouncing away like they always had. He had spent years trying to outrun Lorna's absence. Now he felt her present in the way his daughters leaned closer, in the way the lake still held their shared history without judgment. He wasn't being replaced in this moment. He was being invited back. Ricky didn't speak for a long time after that. He stared across the water, watching a single leaf drift in slow circles near the shore, and felt something he had kept buried finally rise to the surface. "I didn't know how to miss her and still be your dad," he said at last. "So I chose not to miss her at all." Cordia slipped her hand into his. Allison followed, linking their fingers together in a way that felt deliberate. Ricky's shoulders shook, once, then again, as the words he had stored away for years pressed forward without asking permission. "I should have come back sooner," he whispered. No one rushed him. No one told him to be strong. They simply stayed. And in that stillness by the lake, Ricky learned that grief doesn't take something away forever. It just waits until you're finally ready to carry it with the people who love you. The living room didn't look like a penthouse anymore. Ricky had started leaving the lamps on in the evenings, not because he needed the light, but because he wanted the rooms to feel awake when the girls came over. Toys rested in corners instead of being tucked away. Drawings taped to the fridge stayed there even when they clashed with the clean lines he once prized. Tonight, the windows were open just enough to let the city murmur in, distant and harmless. Vernice sat on the couch with Cordia and Allison between them, reading aloud from a book Ricky didn't recognize. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the way the girls leaned in, not toward him or her, but toward the story itself. It wasn't grand. It was enough. Ricky cleared his throat, breaking the rhythm of Vernice's reading. "Can I have a minute?" he asked. The girls slid off the couch without protest, instinctively giving the room back to the adults. Ricky waited until their footsteps faded down the hall before sitting across from Vernice. "I've spent a long time pretending I didn't hurt you," he said, "and longer pretending I didn't hurt them." Vernice folded her hands in her lap, attentive but guarded. "I was afraid of starting something I couldn't control," Ricky continued. "So I ended it before it could matter." He met her eyes. "I'm sorry, not for being confused, but for being unkind when kindness was all you offered." The words didn't come out polished. They didn't need to. They were true. Ricky didn't reach for a ring. He reached for the honesty he had learned to keep close. "I once told you something that closed every door I had to offer," he said. "I thought certainty would keep me safe." Vernice listened without interrupting. "I don't know how to promise you a life without mistakes," Ricky went on, "but I know how to promise I won't hide behind fear again." He shifted closer, not kneeling, not performing, just standing where she could see him. "I don't want to be the man who owns everything and stands alone. I want to be someone worth standing beside." There was no pride in his voice, only choice. "Will you walk with me?" Vernice didn't answer right away. She searched his face, not for perfection, but for proof that the man in front of her wasn't the one who had watched her drive away. "You're different," she said at last. Ricky nodded. "I had to be." She smiled then, not the polite smile she used with clients, but the one he had seen only in quiet moments when she thought no one was measuring her response. "Yes," Bernice said simply. From the hallway, Cordia and Allison peeked around the corner, unable to contain themselves any longer. When Bernice opened her arms, they rushed in, turning the small living room into something that finally felt whole. Ricky stood there, surrounded not by achievement, but by people, and for the first time, he knew exactly where he belonged. Ricky once believed that fear was something you outgrew, that once you had enough money, enough influence, enough control, the parts of life that hurt would lose their power. He spent years proving that idea wrong without ever admitting it to himself. Fear doesn't disappear when life improves, it just changes its disguise. For Ricky, fear dressed itself up as responsibility, as protection, as ambition that looked generous on the outside and isolating on the inside. He told himself he was building a future, when what he was really doing was putting distance between himself and the one thing that had ever made the present feel bearable. Love, on the other hand, never demanded anything dramatic from him. It waited in unanswered calls. In school hallways he never walked down, in a woman who once offered connection without asking for guarantees. It waited even when he spoke words that closed doors instead of opening them. If you think back to the night at the gala, the one that opened the story, Ricky wasn't undone by poverty or failure. He was undone by a truth he could no longer ignore. His daughters weren't choosing Bernice over him. They were choosing the person who showed up. And in that moment, he realized something that changes more lives than we admit. Love doesn't compete. It grows wherever attention lives. Ricky didn't become a better father because he had a moment of insight in a courtyard. He became one because he made a series of small, uncelebrated decisions afterward, to drive instead of being driven, to listen instead of schedule, to fail loudly in the kitchen instead of succeeding quietly in boardrooms. There was no headline when he learned his daughter's favorite songs, no ceremony when he burned dinner. But those moments rebuilt something no amount of money ever had: trust. And when he finally stood in his living room, asking Bernice to walk with him instead of hiding behind certainty, he wasn't offering a perfect future. He was offering presence. That's what fear steals from us most effectively. Not people, not time, but the courage to stay in moments that feel uncertain. Love doesn't remove risk, it makes it worth carrying. So if you've ever told yourself you were too busy to call, too tired to listen, too focused on survival to notice who was drifting away, let Ricky's story be your quiet reminder. The bravest thing you can is stop hiding behind the life you've built and step back into the one that's waiting for you. Before you go, help this story reach someone who might need it. Tap the like button, share this video with a person you care about, and subscribe to Mr. Cooper Stories so you don't miss the next journey. And in the comments, tell me, what does home mean to you?